The way the population works is that 20% of people are amoral sociopaths, 20% of people are good people who want to help, and then 60% do whatever the crowd says. And this is totally true. The reason young men do all those negative things is because that's the path they're given by society.
Back to the idea of the incel revolution. We've talked about a lot of different issues plaguing our current culture at the moment. But when I look at the issue of the young men, I can't help but to think to myself, I mean, when I was 19, I was like way overweight, about 30 kilos overweight. And just, I used to spend all my time indoors playing video games, eating bad food, just like watching porn, doing all of those terrible things. And young guys are just so susceptible to that sort of thing until they develop themselves and get more towards their sort of 30s, I would say. And with the current climate, we've got lonely, sex-starved, single guys with a cost of living crisis that are like essentially broke and lonely. Most guys are going to be broke and lonely. So, I mean, it's the one thing that I grapple with at the moment that I can't even comprehend what that is going to mean in the future. So, when you're looking at future predictions, how do you think this turns out?
Yeah. That makes me think of an interesting study, or if you think of studies that say the way the population works is that 20% of people are amoral sociopaths who will rip off others whenever they can. 20% of people are good people who want to help. And then 60% do whatever the crowd says. And there's interesting studies that show that if you can get the group consensus to change, 60% of people immediately change their thoughts. And that's scary. And what it demonstrates is that once you change the assumptions people believe, most people will just immediately change with them. And I was thinking about that because what you're saying, and this is totally true, is that the reason young men they do all those negative things is because that's the path they're given by society. So the attempt to make themselves excellent, that's something they have to go on a journey as individuals. But most people don't want to do that, or they have no interest in doing so. And what I would say to your question is that if a situation doesn't make sense, it's not going the way you think. So if you add all the assumptions up, and this is something where I've debated a lot of guys in the red pill space about this, where people like to think that everything's going to get worse. Where we are now is what the future is going to be like. You just need to adapt to the current dating climate. But the problem, though, the current dating climate and the current lifestyle is so toxic, it can't survive another 5 years, let alone another 100 years, because it's when a system doesn't make sense, it breaks down. And that's where we're at, where we're in a place where our system is so broken, it's going to break down. The next question is, what direction does it go into after? And if you look at history, there are certain points where hinge moments happen, where slight variations at that time determine the course of the entire history for centuries. And we're going to hit one of those, where choices we make now determine what the future is going to look like. And it's scary, but it's also thrilling, and it's also fun to think about that. And if you can't win a game, break the game or play a different game. And so you stack it's easy to mentally add up all these things are bad. You add up all the things that are screwing young men over, and then you think it's just going to keep going. But then once you add up all the factors of the equation, you end up in a different equation. And that's why I think we're going to have a revolution, because for so many young people, and there's just, as of now, they're screwed. And so their incentive is to actually roll the dice. Because if they're screwed now, even if they roll the dice and die, that's a better chance of succeeding.
And I also think that they're much more inclined to get involved with politics. I think that the next generation, what have we got right now, like Gen X, Zoomers type thing?
Yeah,
I think
alpha.
that the alpha is going to be more radical, because
Yeah.
young guys, if they're not having, if they don't have access to a solid dating market, and if they don't have access to good jobs and a good standard of life, and if they're all sort of coming together on the internet and realizing, hey, are you getting screwed over? I'm getting screwed over. We're all kind of getting screwed over here. They're going to mobilize politically. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily be thrilled to see a massive party of people who are below 30 coming to some form of power, because people below 30 aren't very wise. But so how do you think this is going to reflect politically? And do you see this happening over the next sort of decade or so, where there is actually a mobilization of young men in particular politically?
Yes. I don't have a good prediction for Europe or Australia, so I'm operating off America. And what I see in America is that the leftist elite is completely delusional. They don't see anything, and it's really shocking because I have a couple different avenues to look into this. And if you told them all of this, it just wouldn't register. And I look at the World Economic Forum and the things they say, they have no comprehension of how insane it sounds to the general public. Or you look at the release with the press statements the government releases. The current elite is so detached, and frankly, very few people like them. So I think if there's a revolution, the current ruling class is wiped out very quickly. And you look at the left, the right has advantages and ability to use force. It has a more warlike culture. Most of the men in the military tilts right. Most gun owners tilt right. The police tilts right. The right has a coherent geography. It's where all the resources come from. It's where the electricity comes from. So the right holds all the cards. And there might be some variable I'm miscalculating here, but the right has
It's like the elephant on the chain, isn't it, in a way?
exactly, yes. And so the left doesn't realize this. So the left keeps on egging the right on without the realization that the right has the complete ability to crush them. And that's why I think we'll have a revolution, that you have a dissatisfied group that can't live a normal life, who have all the physical force, versus an arrogant, delusional elite that keeps egging them on, but doesn't realize how weak it is. And so that's what I see happening. The left will get wiped out. The next question is, I think the right will spiral into local warfare, where there is no unifying ideal in the right. If you look at current rightist circles, it's libertarians, it's fascists, hardcore Christians, Nazis, normal conservatives, boomer cons. There's like 10 factions on the right that really share nothing. So that works when the purpose of the right is to push back the left. The problem then is that once the right has power, they can't decide anything. So I think the most likely option is that the left gets crushed, then the right spirals into warlordism, where you see different cults of personality around different right-wing ideas. And so what happens is that these young guys, they form different political factions based off their interests. And I think they're going to end up like killing each other.
Right. Interesting. You know that meme where it says, pick your direction, young man, and it has like the fork in the road? This is the
Yeah.
way that I think about that, right? When I think that we're at that fork in the road at the moment, with it's all coming to a head. And on one side, I see the sort of pacified gimp version of man. And then on the other side, I see the more sort of revolutionary type of path. So if people just become so numb through porn and through AI and automation and video games and all these sorts of things, we could see vast swaths of the population that are actually just numb and immobile, basically, and
Yes.
like massive amounts of people. If this next generation is if this is how the next generation goes, but then on the other side, if it goes the other way, we could see vast amounts of the population actually mobilize and really get involved politically. Those are the
Yes.
only two options I really see, and I think that you kind of described the option where people
Yeah.
mobilize. But do you think that the option where people actually just become numb and everyone gets their universal basic income and they get their Starbucks delivered by a drone to their house, and the liberal elites sort of just keep power?
The way I could see the scenario, the second scenario you describe, is Mouse Utopia, where if we removed Mouse Utopia, I would put no chance in the second scenario you put. However, Mouse Utopia is changing enough assumptions of human nature that I could see it happening. Um, I I would say it's less likely, given that we've hit, if if all the factors we're describing had another 5 years where we hit a political crisis, I could see that. But I think people are so emotional now that you can't bottle it up anymore.
Mm.
And I would guess that the pacification scenario, if there's a civil war and the left wins and the left totally crushes the right, and then the left has purges of conservative young male leadership, you're ending up with that scenario. if there's, or in countries where the left totally dominates, because the left can't be nice to young men, because if they're nice to young men, it destroys all the myths under which their coalition is built. And yeah, another thing I'll throw out here is that if you look at these previous revolutions or civil wars, most people don't want to fight. Most people don't want there to be a war. Before the English Civil War, it was widely said that the English had grown too weak to fight because it had been over a century since England had had a war. But what happens in almost all these cases is most people are apathetic. Small groups of radicals seize power and they conscript normies. Because the problem is the normies don't organize, where no one says, I'm going to riot for normies. We're going to have a normie convention. And so you have this huge part of the population. But when bad things happen, they don't organize. And so their voice doesn't really matter. Meanwhile, if you look at these revolutionary time periods, the Jacobins were something like 1% of France's population. The Jacobins are the people who won the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks were also like 1% of Russia's population. The Puritans who won the English Civil War, they were 10% of England's population. And the Nazis went from complete obscurity to, again, they were a social club Hitler invented, or he didn't invent them, he showed up afterwards. They were a social club in Munich that Hitler took over when it was like a dozen people, and he led them to national dominance. And so Nassim Taleb has got this point of skin in the game, that small groups of radicals control the game because they have the willpower to actually play. And so what I would see in our time is that most people don't want the war. What happens is that you see a breakdown of incentives in which, for the scenario I normally run off is that the US has a budget crisis, and then rather than solving it, red and blue states say that they are the one true government. The red states form a new capital in Austin, change the budget, and they both claim to be the one true American government. So it's legally nothing's changed, but de facto you have two different governments. So what would happen then is that the radicals inside each camp just conscript people, where in the English Civil War, most English didn't want to fight. So what happened was that the royalists and the parliamentarians, they would just drag guys off the bar floor and go into random villages and say, you're in the army now. And I think that's a likely scenario.
If you enjoyed that reality-based podcast clip, make sure to subscribe to the reality-based YouTube channel. We'll be uploading many clips and the full podcast. And also, if you prefer the audible version, you can check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts at Reality Based.